Welcome to the ASPR podcast Inside Conflict with Moritz Ehrmann. Welcome back to Inside Conflict, the podcast of the Austrian Center for Peace, looking at dynamics of conflict and ways to build peace around the globe. In today's episode, we will be discussing conflict dynamics in South Sudan, Uganda, and across these countries' borders, as well as ideas about how some of the underlying issues could be resolved. In today's episode, which will be the first of two, and in which we will discuss certain practical elements of important work being done in the field of peace and conflict in these two countries and in the region, as well as some historic perspectives relating to conflict dynamics in the region. So in this debate today, we will be joined by Mrs. Rose Othieno, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of CECORE, the Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution based in Kampala, Uganda. CECORE is a civil society organization founded in the 1990s to promote a culture of peace and is active mainly in Uganda, but also has partnerships in the Great Lakes and the Horn of Africa regions. For the last 20 years, Rose has been engaged in various activities of the organization, like training different groups and institutions in conflict resolution skills, early warning, and mediation at the local, national, regional, and international level. She is also a gender expert and a strong advocate for women's rights. So Rose, you're joining us directly from Kampala. Welcome to this recording.
Thank you very much.
Also here with us today is Mr. Jan Pospisil, who is a member of the advisory board of the Austrian Center for Peace and our former research director. He is now an associate professor at Coventry University in the United Kingdom. In his academic work, he deals intensively with peace processes and peace agreements, the topic of resilience, and from a geographic perspective, above all, with Sudan and South Sudan. Jan has also led a research area on local peace agreements with the University of Edinburgh, and will be co-responsible for a multi-year follow-up program called the Peace and Conflict Resolution Evidence Platform. Jan, you're joining us directly from Juba. Also very welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, so let's start the conversation looking a bit at the current interesting work that both of you are doing, either in your personal capacity or through the various organizations you're active in. And maybe a first question to you, Rose. CECORE, why was it founded? And what do you mean when you refer to a culture of peace? Is this something that is still relevant now, 30 years on? And what is your main objective today in 2022?
Thank you very much for these very useful questions that are very pertinent to us and our work. I'm very pleased to be part of this podcast, and I'm happy to contribute whatever I can, especially from being part of the founders and also practicing the activities of the organization for the over 20 years. CECORE, Center for Conflict Resolution, was founded in 1995. It is one of many other centers of conflict resolution, but we know that sometimes we differentiate them with abbreviations and acronyms and with geographical location, because there is one strong center in Cape Town in South Africa that we also worked with before. Ours is shortened to CECORE, that we commonly referred to as CECORE. This organization was founded by mainly Ugandans, well, fully Ugandans at that time, who had been working in areas not only of conflict, but also other areas. And why we founded the organization in 1995 was that at that time, the country was getting out of one of the crises, because there have been several, and maybe others continue, as we shall discuss further. But then at this time, there was now a more openness to the work of NGOs and CSOs in the country. But unfortunately, around that time, most of the strong NGOs were international, and even the thematic areas were more to do with humanitarian support, maybe health, and a little bit of governance and human rights, which were just coming on board. Then we realized, yes, much as people usually talk about human rights, the specific area of peace building had a very big gap. So having been people who had worked on peace building with different other organizations at international and regional level, we came together to found this organization that was now country-based, country-founded, and we decided to call it Center for Conflict Resolution to make it easy for people to understand, much as it wasn't, because especially when you talk with people over the phone and you say Center for Conflict Resolution, others would hear more of revolution instead. And said, well, it's not bad to have a revolution around peace. Yes, so yes, it would be the best revolution one would ever have. But then we realized we had to keep these words so as to lay emphasis on the kind of work that we wanted to do. And that goes close to your next question, what is meant by a culture of peace? Because we wanted now to promote, maintain, and preach peace among the communities, because the communities had been saddened by different insurgencies that had, riddled the country for quite a while. And that is why our main objective was and still is to have alternative means of bringing peace, of handling conflicts, of transforming peace among the communities. Creative in that with peace work, there is no one size fits all. So we have to be very, very contextual. We have to be very creative depending on the area we are working in, the themes we are tackling, and even the grouping and the age we are working with. That's why we say, let's be creative ways of building peace. We cannot have a manual and we start preaching about what that manual does without contextualizing the issues. Yes, and it is still very relevant. Unfortunately, I would actually say it's more relevant now, because when we were coming out of the other conflict, first, systems had been good, much as we had had conflicts in the education sector, in the social sector, in the health sector. Systems had been good, although there had been conflicts. The population was smaller, but now the population is very, very much bigger. I think at that time we were less than 10 million. Now we are coming to almost 50 million. Wow. And this big population, well, they talk of 44, but we don't know how accurate this is. That's about 2012 or something census. So we decided to do this in order to help the people. And as I said, it's still relevant because as the population, sorry, I'm just reinforcing my battery. The population is bigger and the dynamics have increased. So it is still as relevant as, it may be more relevant than before. And for that reason, we are also being a little more creative. If I can just go a little bit deeper into that. Because when we started, we thought, yes, we are a civil society organization with the mandate to mainly give people skills in peace building, so would go do trainings on conflict resolution, mediation if we could. But over time, we would say, go to communities, and then we preach, so to say, this message of peace, and then especially among the youth, because in this country we have some communities that are armed, and they use a lot of the guns to disrupt communities. There's a pastoral area where we, oh dear, sorry. Sister.
Rose, we can get back later to some of the.
You can hear me.
Yes. We can get back later to some of the underlying issues, also to historic perspectives on what's happening in your country and how that is related to current dynamics. Maybe at this point, let me direct a question to Jan, and we'll get back to you, Rose, in a moment. So, Jan, what is your research interest in South Sudan and East Africa in general? So, what is your focus at the moment? What interests you? And also, I've been with you myself to South Sudan, to Juba, and you are behaving like as if you were a local there. You are actually a resident. So, what prompted you to explore that region to a point that you now call it your second home?
Well, on the last question first, there's always things that happen a bit accidentally. You get. In fact, my research in the region started with Uganda, which makes it very interesting to have this combination today, where I was in 2006 for a longer research based when I did my PhD. The work in South Sudan in particular and in the Horn region is, for me, interesting for a variety of reasons. One, it is my interest in peace processes brought me here. And you have, in basically all the countries in the region, Uganda being a bit of an exception since it has developed differently and really peacefully over the last 20 years. But you have ongoing peace processes in most other countries at the moment. And comparing them, and especially seeing them in what they do in the regional configuration in the Horn, is a very interesting research question for me, and it's linking up even further because there is processes on the other side of the Red Sea, Yemen, in other parts that are actually in a way almost connected. Libya, the same. You have tensions between Ethiopia, Egypt, and interestingly, South Sudan in a way is in the middle of all this, which makes it a very, very interesting place. And in a way, even a bit more, even though the South Sudanese conflict, which is in a way still ongoing despite the ongoing peace process, might be internationally forgotten, it is regionally a quite significant role that South Sudan plays, which makes it, without sounding cynical, an actually very interesting case to research.
Yeah, very straightforward logic. Also, having been there with you, I can understand why you like being there. Beautiful country. Uganda, I heard, of course, an even more beautiful country, if I may say.
Very beautiful.
Yes. Jan, let's still stay with you for a moment, and then let's get back to Rose. So South Sudan separated from Sudan as the world's newest country in 2011. And of course, expectations of peace, economic development, stability, progress, with the huge international funding and support that was pouring into South Sudan, was quite high. Then, of course, large-scale violence relapsed in 2013 and 2016. And the country, as you've also mentioned in your introduction, is struggling ever since. So what has happened?
Yeah, this is a question that that is moving many people. I mean, I guess the main problem was or is in a historical perspective that South Sudan has never been governed as one entity. And this is something which is institutionally making a big difference to a lot of other places, because even during colonialism, there was hardly any colonial officers there. They would die. A few would come here and they would die in scores. Infrastructure is very bad. There was never roads. Large parts of this country are completely inaccessible. Still, when rainy season comes, you find even problems with helicopters. So you go to places and helicopters couldn't even land. Otherwise, you have to wait for the next dry season for them to go back. And this makes it a very, very hard place to be governed as one. And during the war with the North, SPLA, which was essentially the South Sudanese liberation movement, actually was designed not as an independence movement, but as a movement to change Sudan as a whole. And combined with that, it was actually also never that uniform movement as in other places, like compared with Uganda's national resistance movement, for instance, which was much more like one organization, with clear institutional kind of lines. Whereas in South Sudan, it was always a linkage with a lot of like more community militias, tribal militias that are quite strong. Even now, like the New Right Army, always kind of connected during the independence war with SPLA. They can mobilize 10,000 people overnight without even having a standing army structure. And this makes it very difficult conditions for government. And I think it was a bit of a high expectation to think that this kind of area, which is as big as basically Ukraine or France, almost with 12 million inhabitants only, that this can be governed just overnight. It's obviously a very difficult process, and institutionally, it has been there has never been a functional government in place.
Okay, so big challenges ahead, and we will talk more about in the next episode how they could be tackled, what are today's perspectives, and what we could look forward to. But still within this episode, let's get back to you, Rose, and look at some of the historic perspectives of conflict dynamics in Uganda. Uganda, of course, became independent from the UK already in 1962 and has experienced intermittent violent conflicts since then, including military coups, violent regimes, notoriously including Idi Amin's rule in the 1970s, with the current president in power since 1986. So the country is yet to witness a truly democratic handover, if we want to say, from power from one leader to another. And election-related violence is common. So think about the last presidential elections in 2021. Now the question to you, and still from a historic perspective, why has there been so much violence in the history of Uganda? And what, in your assessment, were the main triggers of this violence, of conflict in the past?
Thank you. I will just say briefly, I'll not get into too much detail about the dynamics of violence in the country, right from maybe even pre-colonial days, because history tells us that before colonialism, there would be fights, if you want to term them wars, but I would put this more as to fights between different tribes, especially fighting for territory and leadership. But that wasn't too highlighted. We then had colonialists come in that in a way also came with a divide and rule strategy. That is part of the problem that I think we still keep seeing today, Although whenever I sit with colleagues in these spaces, I always say, well, they may have come and they did the negative, they created the negative impact, but honestly, for many of the countries, it is 60 or 50 years. Should we continue lamenting about this? But when you come to think about it, probably the communities, citizens never really had time to go over all that and build for themselves. So we find that even in the independence era, there were political parties were introduced. We have in this country places that had kingdoms, and then in this current regime that you talked about, these kingdoms came, were returned. But when independence came, because Uganda was supposed to be a republic, these kingdoms were, would I say, disempowered. And that was already another cause for tensions, although not so loud. But at one point, the first big issue with the post-independence was when the then Prime Minister, Milton Obote, who later became the president, went and attacked the palace of the king, the Kabaka, is the title given to the king of the Buganda area where the capital sits. Because, I mean, Kampala is within a kingdom, and that in itself is an issue, because this is I would say, the strongest of the kingdoms that are there. So they attacked the palace. The king ran into exile in the UK, and that's where he died. I think the body was later returned. So all those tensions have been there. So what I would like to stress here is the fact that in Uganda, at political level, there have been lots of conflicts, but not so much at the inter-community levels per se, like tribe against tribe, not so much. Of course, there is this mistrust, stereotype, but it was not as strong. But more of this is played at political level, and then the leaders use this, like in the post-colonial era, we had two main parties of the Democratic Party and the Uganda People's People's Congress, which was led by the then Paul Milton Obote. But at the same time, religion came in, because the Democratic Party mainly had Catholics on board. The UPC mainly had Protestants, the strongest religion at that time. And it was almost like taboo for you, a Catholic, to be a Uganda People's Congress member. You know, it's like that. It's only in recent times that citizens started dissociating religion with politics. But when it had just come, it was like, that's what was. One thing is, I think, little education and awareness in these issues. And then the governments came. I think not much was being done. That was not being well handled, because you'd have the party at the top having all the powers, doing whatever they could, much as we had institutions in place of judiciary and all the rest. So over time, that led to now the rebellions that were brought about with the NRM, which started with different other movements, you know, and then culminated into NRM. And then with the coming of the Uganda People's Movement, there was hope for a change, because the ideas were good. They came with very beautiful 10-point programs, which were all good. But from the analysts, it's like the leaders, the top leadership did not live to those promises. And then that started bringing, you know, dissent amongst the people. And we've had rebellions, especially in this current government, because the first rebellion, of course, that we had was when the Amin was overthrown and his people went away out of, I think they went to South Sudan that time, wasn't yet divided. They launched a rebellion. We had rebels in the northwestern part of the country. And of course, we had all that. And later on, some agreements were made, others were taken on board, but there are a lot of remnants there, and then unfulfilled promises or neglect. Because as a peace builder for us, we have these statements that we always hear from our leaders, that now we have peace. Even now, they'll tell you there is peace. simply because there's not much gun violence. So without conventional wars, they get convinced there is peace. For us, we know peace is beyond that. And that is part of the problem why we still have dynamics of conflicts now, because people are not at peace, and there are so many other areas that maybe as we continue the discussions, we can be highlighting. Yeah, so our objectives have changed over the time with our work to try to address some of these things. The alternative ways of handling them, not really the main objectives, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting, and of course extremely important in the kind of work that you're doing to remain flexible, as especially was such a long time that you have been active with your organization, and dynamics of course changing during the course of the years. Maybe as a last question in this episode,
yes.
So there is of course dynamics. Historic dynamics also happening between Uganda and South Sudan, and especially dynamics going on in the border regions between both of these countries. Rose, very quickly, how would you describe sort of the dynamic of relations between the two countries over the years?
The relations between the two countries, I would say, have not been that bad. Like the border conflicts, I think have arisen more of because of the resources that communities are fighting for. They have it has not been very prominent, although we know they have come up. It starts as a fight because of the resources, and then something again that comes right from the colonial era is in that these borders, as they like to term them, are artificial. I mean, they are not realistic. We call them artificial. I don't know why everything is artificial. They are not realistic because they were dividing communities. They were dividing families. They were dividing even homes. All the borders, not just the South Sudan. You go to Kenya, but because the Kenya-Uganda border, we have not had too much of conflicts. You don't see that playing out, but especially South Sudan, it's because of that. There was a district where one country claims my border stops the other side, this border stops there. That was mainly, but it has not played out so much as for the fight against the borders, because even as we talk and as we record all these claims of different borderlines, the communities are moving across. The refugees have moved across. South Sudanese refugees have been in Uganda. Ugandans were refugees, especially during the time of the Idi Amin era. So that has not been as a big a problem as what happens within the countries, the conflicts within the countries, which are mainly the political, and of course they come with the economic. And once you have economic issues, honestly, if people cannot live to their expectations, they cannot fulfill their needs, then everything else plays out badly. But the border issue has not been as strong, I would say, as someone who lives around here.
Okay, thanks very much. Jan, anything to add? You also know both countries, but particularly from a South Sudanese perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the relationships between these two countries are very important, and there is security elements, there's cultural elements, there is also strong economic connections. I mean, the whole south of South Sudan, basically the whole Equatoria region, is socially, culturally, economically very closely linked with Uganda, with several of the communities living across the borders, like the Chole. You find them in Uganda as well as in South Sudan, on the South Sudanese side. Just for instance, there's several others as well. And especially for Juba, the capital, basically the whole supplies, being it food, being it fuel, being it whatever, comes from Uganda over the one road from Kampala or Soroti up to the Nimule border, and then on this one road up to South Sudan. So basically there's complete economic independence on Uganda to an extent. With one of the additional problems that due to the very unstable situation in the Equatorias, this road is subject to ambushes quite regularly. The last ambush was beginning of this week when three people were shot on the basically the only road that connects these two countries and where everything goes through, which makes especially Juba economically also very vulnerable, because if you directly target the trucks from Uganda stop and nothing comes to Juba, and you have a huge crisis immediately with fuel stopping and food prices hiking basically overnight. The second connection is, of course, a security cooperation that is there, especially during the first phase of the civil war in South Sudan, 2013-14. It was the Ugandan army that was moving into South Sudan and basically creating a huge safety zone where the whole Equatorians were taken out of the conflict basically and safeguarded by the Ugandan army. And I think the move was that there was the fear that the conflict would spill over to parts of Uganda, and this was basically a forward defense move that UPDF did. This changed then in the second phase when the conflict then moved basically south, and when some of these areas became like hotspots of the civil war, very close to the Ugandan border, which led to these huge refugee movements that then happened. But I guess like the security cooperation between Uganda and South Sudan is still high on the agenda. There is a huge interest in Uganda on the South Sudanese peace process because because of what Rose mentioned, these close interlinkages there. And of course, it's also a social thing. Like even during the long Sudanese civil war, like loads of South Sudanese would move to Uganda, would go to school there, would go to university there, have their kids even in Kampala. So there is, of course, like strong cultural ties that are linking these two countries. And this is, in fact, something that the whole region kind of can be characterized. People move in this region, and it's of course everybody's kind of attached to their own kind of countries and communities in a way, but this region is one in movement really, which makes it also a very interesting and nice place to.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting conversation with the two of you. We will continue the conversation in the next episode. We're also hoping to get joined by another prominent and interesting speaker from the region, and then look at some of the more current dynamics in peace and conflict today in South Sudan, Uganda, and the region. Perhaps also look a bit more at the issue of climate change and environmental issues as a driver of conflict in specific. But for now, thank you very much, dear Rose and Jan. Excellent conversation. Thank you very much. And we will be back in a couple of weeks with the next episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Yeah, and that was great sharing with your discussions on this.
Subscribe to our podcast or visit the website insideconflict.com. For more information about the work of the ASPR, visit aspr.ac.at. Until next time.